all of these. Subcommittee will come to order. Today marks our 11th hearing in a series on the future of Social Security for this generation and the next. At our last hearing, we heard from a number of those creators of personal savings account proposals who see the accounts as a key component in Social Security reform. Today, we'll hear from experts in the economy, the field of investments and capital markets, and representatives of institutions who would be key players in establishing a personal savings account system. Personal savings account may be an answer, especially for young people, to meet the challenge of providing for their own retirement. Someone once said, you cannot plow a field by turning it over in your own mind. We need to have accurate and expert information about the important design elements needed to ensure any new system would actually work. While the structure for individual investment is critical, the success of any system will depend on cost-effective and responsive administration. Critical to that operation will be the institutions, many not involved in the Social Security system today. That would be the nexus between the participating worker and the government agency that administers the overall retirement systems. To ensure a successful operation, a system of personal accounts must have minimal and equitable administrative cost, create no undue burden on employers, and make the operation of the system and the obligation of the investor easy to understand and use for the participants. I look forward to hearing the advice of our witnesses today to help us determine the detailed and practical options that would be needed to resolve in designing a working of a personal savings account component as part of Social Security reform. In the interest of time, it is our practice to dispense of opening statements except for the ranking Democrat member. All members are welcome to submit statements for the record. I yield to Congressman Kennelly for any statements she wishes to make.
Thank you, Chairman Bunning. And as you have noted, this is the 11th hearing into the future of Social Security that you have held for this subcommittee. And we've held hearings on the broad issues related to Social Security and on specific proposals to change the system. In my view, our purposes need to be to strengthen Social Security for the future. We need to assure that future generations of workers, retirees, and their families continue to receive an adequate, guaranteed retirement benefit from Social Security. We need to assure individuals that they will receive a benefit that is protected against inflation and will last a lifetime. Social Security provides important protection for widows, orphans, and the disabled. We need to make sure that these protections are not eroded. We need to assure that we do not jeopardize benefits for women who have stayed home for part of their careers to raise children or to take care of older parents. And finally, we need to assure that any reforms we adopt do not benefit higher-income individuals at the expense of middle-income and lower-income individuals. These are important principles that we have to keep in mind as we progress with our hearings. We must face up to the demographic challenges before us, but we must not undermine the protections afforded by the most efficient program of this century. Our hearings today focus on the effects of individual accounts. A study to issue this week by Congressional Research Services analyzes the impact that some individual account plans will have on Social Security benefits and protections. The study calculates the size of Social Security benefit cuts that will occur under 3 different Social Security reform plans. The study finds that under a plan in which 2 percentage points of Social Security revenue is diverted into individual accounts, Social Security benefits must be cut significantly. Today's 38-year-old retiring at age 65 in the year 2025 would have a 33% reduction in his Social Security benefit, even if an individual account provided an extraordinary rate of return equal to the past performance of the Standard & Poor's 500 index. The accumulation in the account would still leave the 38-year-old considerably worse off than he would be today. Our witnesses today will discuss the impact of individual accounts on the economy and on individuals. We must take a careful look at all of these ramifications of these plans before we will act. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to enter into the record by unanimous consent the Heritage Foundation white paper on the CRS Social Security study at this time. We will begin.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Thank you. I meant to ask that the study that I referred to that was requested by Chairman Rangel be entered into the record. May I have that entered in?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Our first panel we will hear from today starts with Dr. Michael Boskin, Senior Fellow from the Hoover Institute, and Tully M. Friedman, Professor of Economics from Stanford University. Dr. Peter Diamond, Institute Professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and co-chair of the National Academy on Social Security's panel on privatization of Social Security. Francis Cavanaugh, former Executive Director of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, and Dr. Sylvester Schreiber, Vice President of Watson Wyatt Worldwide. That's a mouthful. Member of the Social Security Advisory Board and former member of the 1994-96 Advisory Council on Social Security. Dr. Boskin, if you would begin, please.
Thank you, Chairman Bunning, Mrs. Kennelly, and other distinguished members of the committee. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to appear before the committee and any of its subcommittees. I've been doing this for 2 decades in formal sessions such as this and informal retreats on trade, tax, and entitlement issues. And I've always found this committee to be an arena, despite the various political issues that arise, where people need to and take the time to understand the complexities of complex issues. I want to commend you for your series of hearings. There's a lot of discussion and argumentation out in the public about what some programs would do, pro and con, that I think is overly simplistic. So I applaud you're investing this much time and energy in exploring these important issues. I want to make 3 big points and 1 little one, and leave much of that, the fleshing out of the smaller one, to Q&A. The first big point is to help set the context for why it's important to seriously consider the adoption of a personal account or an individual account component to Social Security. There are those who would argue that Social Security is in very good shape. Its current operating surpluses demonstrate that current revenues are exceeding current outlays, that by the intermediate projections all we'd have to do is raise taxes 2.25 percentage points today and we'd have 75-year actuarial balance. I think that's very misleading. We'd still have a large actuarial balance thereafter. There is an enormous unfunded liability in the current projected Social Security benefit stream, several times the current national debt. If we wait and do nothing and act passively or nibble around the edges and don't do something in the near future, the types of tax rates we will ultimately wind up with will be on the order of 50% higher than today. And we have a similar set of issues, not quite as severe, but a similar set of issues in Medicare. And that is likely to lead us to Western European-style tax rates. The high tax rates in Western Europe relative to the U.S. are one of the major reasons why those several hundred million people have had a stagnant economy and no net private sector job growth in a quarter century. I would not like to see a similar fate await us. There's also considerable evidence that the level and structure of Social Security are one of the low reasons for the low personal saving rate in the U.S. and for the substantial reduction in the labor force participation of people 55 and over in the United States. I say these things just to state that there's far more at stake than just the future of Social Security, as vitally important as that is. This program is so large and so important, affecting virtually every American now and in the future as a taxpayer and potential recipient or actual recipient today, that it can have, how you deal with this can have major impacts on our overall economy. So the impacts of any reforms you take will be direct through taxes and benefits and structure of the system, and also will be spread widely among all Americans through the impact it has on the economy. We all know the demographic trends. Most of the emphasis focuses on the coming of age and the impending retirement of the baby boom generation. There's also been an enormous increase in the life expectancy of the elderly. It's going up a month a year every year. So it's like every year we live, we get a bonus month in expected value terms. That's unambiguously good news, by the way, even though it imposes extra costs on Social Security. But it does raise an issue, for example, about how you deal with people who are very old and whether the system that was set up at a time when there are very few very old people is the one we want 20 or 30 years from now. So I think, and also I would add that this demography suggests if something isn't done now, in the next 1, 2, 3 years, and we wait until the baby boomers start to retire, the fraction of voters who will be in the system or about to be in the system, and hence who will resist any change in their benefits and try to have any resolution of the long-run actuarial problems be taxes on future workers, will go up precipitously. So I think there's a political urgency of the problem that is not often appreciated. I believe personal accounts are a very important, promising, and perhaps even vital component of an overall system of Social Security reform. Along with my Stanford colleague John Chauvin and Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University, at the time of the '83 reforms, we proposed a system of personal accounts for some of the same reasons and some others, and in a different context that was discussed now. But I think it is important to establish that the establishment of personal accounts done properly, and you'll hear much more of that from the rest of this panel and the next, has the capacity to increase the saving rate, particularly among low and lower middle income people who are liquidity constrained. It is likely, therefore, to take some pressure off of Social Security in the long run, as well as to have some good effects directly on those people. And importantly, and I think this is a generic social comment, I believe it is tremendously important for us to extend the benefits of asset ownership to those who currently have or are likely to have very little assets at retirement. I would say it's analogous to avoid disenfranchising, as has occurred in Europe, tragically, a large part of the labor potential workers from the labor market. The personal accounts obviously come in many forms. You've discussed some in previous hearings. There were different proposals from the Advisory Council. Most of the discussion recently limits them to the retirement component of Social Security, leaving disability, HI, survivors, and dependents components in the defined benefit system. And there are many choices and combinations, mandatory or voluntary, contributions made by or through individuals, employers, collected by the government, funds invested by the government or contracted out to private financial institutions, or directly from individuals or employers to private institutions. The funding that has been proposed in some instances comes from an allocation of a part of the FICA tax, and others from refundable credits from current and projected future budget surpluses. That is from general revenues.
I'm going to have to interrupt because we have, if you will wrap up your testimony,
Okay, sure.
I would appreciate it.
Yes, I will, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that it is important as you look at these and as you decide which of the many possibilities for establishing personal accounts is the best system, that you take into account when you evaluate them the entire system. Do not, as the recent CRS proposal analysis is, ignore the benefits from the individual accounts when you look at people's benefits. Do not assume that using the surpluses doesn't have an opportunity cost in terms of foregone tax cuts or other uses of those funds. And in doing so, I believe that you'll come to the conclusion that personal accounts can be an important component of Social Security reform that strengthens the system, provides greater individual incentives, strengthens the economy, and dramatically reduces the need for very large future tax increases, would be very damaging for our economy. Thank you very much.
If you have long statements past the 5 minutes, I would prefer them that you enter into the record without objection. We'll enter them in.
Okay, I'd ask mine, please.
Okay. Dr. Diamond, if you would continue.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm pleased and honored to be here today. Some advocates look to individual accounts to substantially, individual accounts with equity investments, of course, to substantially increase the rate of return from Social Security, substantially increase national savings and economic growth. At the same time, some analysts have looked at investment in equities by the trust fund and have concluded that's not an improvement in our retirement income system. My main message for today is that trust fund investment in equities and individual account investment in equities are very, very similar to each other. And understanding that similarity will help to understand the role of individual accounts in improving our retirement income system. They're similar but not identical. There are three important economic differences. One is the costs are obviously higher with any individual account system than with trust fund investment in equities. Second, the risk characteristics put more of the risk directly on those retiring if you have individual accounts. And third, the ability to integrate the retirement income system with the disability system, the benefits for children who lose parents, the benefits for divorcees and elderly divorced women are among the poorest of our elderly. That integration goes better in a fully defined benefit system. But let me focus on the similarities, because that's the important message I'm trying to bring. Let's trace through what would happen if the trust fund were to buy equities. If the trust fund buys equities, it finances that by holding less in Treasury bonds. The Treasury then has to sell more bonds to the public. Where does the public get the money to buy the bonds? That's easy. It gets the money from having sold the equities to the trust fund. In other words, this is an asset swap. The public ends up holding more Treasury bonds and fewer equities. The trust fund ends up holding more equities and fewer Treasury bonds. The fact that it's an asset swap means its first impact on the economy is very small. That doesn't mean there aren't important effects over time, but that first impact is very small. Now let's trace through the same sequence for individual accounts. Assume that part of the payroll tax revenue goes into individual accounts instead of going to the trust fund. What happens? The trust fund, having less revenue, will hold fewer Treasury bonds. The Treasury will have to sell more bonds to the public. Where will the public get the money to buy those bonds? They'll get it from having sold equities to the individual accounts. Once again, it is simply an asset swap. And it has, to a first approximation, skipping the three elements I identified to begin with, the same effects. Individual accounts have the same effects as trust fund investment in the same portfolio. So individual accounts by themselves don't increase national savings. And individual accounts by themselves don't increase a risk-adjusted rate of return on Social Security. To increase national savings, we need to put new revenue into the individual accounts. If we devote new revenue to individual accounts, then we can increase national savings. If we devote the same new revenue to building up the trust fund, we get the same increase in national savings. That new revenue will raise the long-run rate of return on Social Security for our children and grandchildren coming down the road. But in order to get the new revenue, some people have to be giving something up today, whether it's a higher payroll tax increase or not getting some tax cut or benefit from expenditure that might come from alternative uses of the surplus. And that means that the rate of return from Social Security goes down for the people who are financing the new revenue, at the same time that it goes up for future generations who will be benefiting from it. And that analysis holds for individual accounts and holds for trust fund investment in equities. I could get into the cost differences and the risk differences, but the light's already yellow, and this is probably the right time to stop.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kavanaugh, would you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delighted to be here. I'll comment briefly on the 4 issues your subcommittee asked me to address. First, the effect of Social Security PSA investments on the capital markets would be slight and gradual increases in demand for corporate stocks and possibly other private investments and corresponding decreases in demand for U.S. Treasury securities. As funds are diverted from the Social Security Trust Fund, which is now invested solely in Treasury securities, Treasury will increase its borrowing in the private market. Treasury borrowing costs might increase slightly, but such increases might be offset in part by savings to the Treasury from reducing issues to the trust fund on preferential terms. PSA investments in stocks would probably never exceed 2% of the capitalization of the U.S. stock market. Your second issue, the cost and administration of the PSAs, needs much more study. Just hasn't been done. This country has no experience with a mandatory system of individual accounts dependent upon the performance of very small employers and very low-income employees. In 1994, 46% of workers for whom Social Security taxes were paid earned less than $15,000. Assuming 2% of a $15,000 income, or $300, were invested annually in a PSA, the earnings in such a small account would generally be more than offset by the cost of servicing the account in the first several years of the plan. The net earnings of the average PSA would probably never equal the net earnings of the funds invested in Treasury securities in the Social Security Trust Fund. The administration of PSAs for 140 million Social Security employees, if modeled after the 2.3 million member federal thrift savings plan, would require at least 10,000 highly trained federal employees to man the telephones and answer employee questions. PSAs would require the cooperation of 6.5 million private employers, most of whom could not meet TSP reporting standards. Federal agencies generally report payroll deductions and other employee data to the TSP and magnetic tape, but over 80% of private employers are still reporting to the Social Security Administration on paper, an extraordinarily costly and error-prone process. The cost of error correction, say for failure to make timely stock market investments, would be more than many small employers could bear. Your third issue, investor education, is a statutory requirement for the TSP. The Office of Personnel Management has a primary responsibility for training, with the Thrift Investment Board itself conducts hundreds of training sessions each year throughout the country for personnel and payroll officers and individual plan participants. These sessions, along with the TSP summary plan document, animated video, investment booklet, pamphlets, posters, and other materials, require extensive support from the federal employing agencies. Such support could not be provided by most of the 6.5 million employers in the Social Security program, given their lack of resources, the relatively low income of the average private employee, and the language difficulties. Meeting TSP standards, if possible at all, could be accomplished only at a price so high as to reduce net investment earnings to unacceptably low levels. As to your fourth issue, the role of employers, large and small, in a PSA system, large employers with competent personnel, payroll, and systems experts could be expected to perform the functions now performed by the TSP for the federal by the federal employing agencies. Yet most private employers have less than 10 employees. Also, household employers who hire part-time providers of cleaning and other domestic services are obviously ill-equipped to meet the employee information needs of a PSA system. I believe it would be impossible to establish cost-effective TSP-type PSAs for the Social Security system. That is, the net investment earnings after administrative expenses of the PSAs would be less than the net earnings of Social Security Trust Fund investments in Treasury securities. Nor would the IRA-type alternative be cost-effective because of the relatively high administrative costs of small accounts. The only feasible way for the Social Security system to benefit from the higher returns offered by the stock market is to invest a portion of the trust fund in stocks, which is what virtually all large public and private pension and retirement funds have already done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cavanaugh. Dr. Schieber?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also pleased to appear before the subcommittee today to talk about these vitally important issues. In my prepared remarks, I address each of the major questions that the committee put forward. The primary basis of my comments today will focus on the administrative issues, and if I have time, I'll speak a bit to the employer issues as well. In establishing a PSA system, legislators will have to create an administrative system and regulatory structure that is efficient. Here there are two general approaches. The first would create a centrally structured system along the lines that you just heard Peter Diamond advocate. The second would establish Mr. Kavanaugh advocate. The second would establish a regulatory framework for workers to create their own PSAs through a myriad of investment options available in the financial markets. There are two fundamental issues at stake. One is the desire to minimize administrative costs. The other is the desire to minimize the intrusion of the federal government in the free operation of businesses and its citizens in carrying out their economic activities. These two considerations pull in opposite directions. There is no doubt that concentrating the administration of a personal account program within a single entity would render potential economies of scale. On the other side, the question is whether we can craft a system that allows workers freedom in setting up their own accounts that have acceptable costs associated with them. In my prepared testimony, I explore ways to set up a system of accounts that would give workers more flexibility than a centrally managed system would. I cannot go into that fully here. But to prove that such a system is achievable, we can look at Australia, which has established a national individual account system. Under their system, workers' accounts tend to be organized at the employer or the union level. Under their system, the system is measured by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The administrative costs run about 90 basis points a year, about 0.9%. A question raised by the added costs involved in a more flexible system is why would we would want to bear such costs unless they were absolutely unavoidable. There are two parts to the answer. The first is an assessment of whether the federal government can be an accumulator of a substantial share of our capital base. In my prepared remarks, I look at the historical debate and attempts at funding Social Security. Frankly, I do not believe that we can pre-fund these retirement obligations directly through government accumulation. The second part of the answer relates to whether it is desirable to have the federal government be a substantial owner of our private capital base. Again, I do not believe that this Congress or any future one can create a firewall around a centrally managed fund that will insulate the fund from political manipulation. I think that's very important. Undoubtedly, the establishment of a mandated system of individual retirement accounts will create the need for more education on investment than is now available. The research that I have done on 401k plans, however, is instructive of how people actually behave when they have retirement assets that they control themselves. Our research indicates that workers in 401k plans invest in reasonable patterns. Older workers invest more conservatively than younger ones. Low-wage workers invest more conservatively than high-wage workers. We have found that women are as effective, if not more so, in their use of 401k plans than their male counterparts. Our results do not mean that education of the public about investing will not be a challenge. It does suggest, however, that it's not an insurmountable one. Indeed, I believe it is not only doable, I think it is also highly desirable. Employers' role will depend on the nature that reform takes. In Australia, the provision of individual accounts is generally implemented at the employer level. In Chile, employers have very little role. One of the things that people are worried about if we implement a reform of this sort is that employers will cut back on their own commitment to their own plans. As I point out in my prepared testimony, that really depends on whether or not the reform system becomes more generous than the current system. If it does, it is likely employers will curtail their plans. If it is not more generous, there is no reason for them to do so. In closing, though, I think one thing everybody should be aware. There is some prospect that employer plans will be curtailed in the future because they're facing the same kind of cost pressures that Social Security is facing. And so I think it makes it even more important as you toil with this issue that we figure out how to secure these benefits that we have been holding out to people. And I frankly believe a personal account option is a superior way to do that. Thank you very much.
I would appreciate for the first panel if they would remain here. We have to go vote. We have 2 votes, and we will be back as soon as possible. So we'll stand adjourned for the time it'll take us to vote and get back. Thank you.
We're having technical difficulties with our signal from this event. We're working to solve the problems. We're having technical difficulties with our signal from this event. We're working to solve the problems.
Just a word about our plan. As I said, it preserves much of the best features of the current system, but the main feature of it is the creation of a individual savings account, personal savings account, through a carve-out of 2% of the current 12.4% payroll tax to provide financial security for all disabled, low-income students or low-income seniors, as well as for all other seniors. Restoring the solvency of Social Security requires some very tough choices, as this subcommittee knows very well, and it requires some trade-offs. And those who extract specific components of our comprehensive plan for criticism have an obligation to suggest other benefit cuts or tax increases to replace them without weakening the program's solvency. Now, Mr. Chairman, the CRS report that was released today analyzes 3 Social Security reform proposals, the one done by the National Commission on Retirement Policy, the one I'm co-chairing, Senator Moynihan and Kerry's proposal, and the Social Security Advisory Council proposal prepared by Robert Ball. But the restrictions that were placed on the analysis by the requester suggest that the study was designed specifically to discourage or disparage any reform plan that contains a personal retirement component. What's most troubling to us from an analytical perspective is that the request included design specifications that were seemed to be concocted specifically to promote particular policy views. And any fair analysis of a personal account proposal would obviously include the income coming from those personal accounts. And yet, CRS was specifically directed to count income accruing from the investment of personal accounts as equal to 0. Whereas if it was invested by the government in a government account, it was to be fully counted and funded. Now, you're talking about starting with more than one hand tied behind your back when you start with that kind of analysis. It's a very odd value judgment that investment in the private market generates income only when government controls the investment, but not when an individual does. But that's exactly what CRS was directed to do. Putting market forces to work to improve retirement benefits for workers typically has been discussed as an either-or proposition. Do we allow workers to invest for their own retirement, or do we entrust the government with that? Our plan allows individuals to determine their retirement future. We believe that individual accounts have huge potential benefits, higher national savings rate, ultimately higher wages for workers, higher returns on contributions, and hence higher benefits for retirees. The government investment approach, whatever the scale of it, doesn't address the central concern behind the calls for personal ownership of the account, and that is namely that voters should have their own stake in the economy, that citizens should have their own stake in the economy and more control over their retirement benefits. The current system provides a mere statutory right to benefits, which Congress can cut at any time in the future. Thus, such security is really illusory. Mr. Chairman, it's true that current law promises a benefit that is higher than does our plan for a low-income earner retiring in 2040. But under current law, the system would be insolvent before that point, or at best it would be have only enough money to pay less than 75% of the benefit promises. That's a 25% decrease in Social Security benefits. So by not taking that into account of what is in current law, you have again, in another way, completely skewed the analysis that was done by the Congressional Research Service. I mentioned this, Mr. Chairman, because we really need to have a comprehensive and honest and open dialogue on this subject next year. And we're not going to be helped when we have this kind of thing going on, when people approach it from the very beginning from an ideological standpoint to disparage one kind of provision or another. We need to be able to look at all the different provisions. And I'm pleased to say that the administration has kept an open mind on this. And I would hope that other members of the Congress would do that as well, because this is going to be the single most important debate, as I think you know, next year that this Congress is going to take up. And I want to commend you and your committee for having this hearing today. The full testimony will go into some analysis of the CRS study. We have asked for a revision based on comparing apples to apples, so that you'll be comparing real things here when they revise it. And I think you'll find that it's a completely different study the next time it comes out. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. I will tell you this. Before we are finished the hearings that we are having on these issues, we will have a total package to look at, and it won't be skewed one way or the other.
I thank you very much.
Now we'll get back to our first panel and our questions to our first panel.
Jim?
Let me address an open question to the first panel. We have heard a lot about investment risk and rates of return. However, one very apparent but not qualified risk is political risk, which certainly exists in the taxpayer's mind. As we will hear later, we have taken the surplus FICA receipts, spent them on other parts of government, and given the trust funds an IOU that has a nice coupon rate but can only be redeemed at the cost of increased taxes or federal indebtedness. Younger generations of workers who die early know other political risk from a system that may return very little to them through the current system structure. Therefore, this political risk exists and is real as market risks are real. Private investors have some control over their risk and cost in their portfolios, even when it is through a 401k plan. What controls over political risk does a FICA taxpayer or a retiree have in the system? You want to, all of you want to take a shot at that, or one person? If we eventually decide on some kind of private investment account.
It seems to me that political risks come in two forms. One form is when the outside environment, whether it's economic or demographic, changes, then existing institutions have to adapt to them. And exactly how that happens is going to depend on some future Congress. And nobody today can predict what a future Congress is going to do. And so that's some political risk. The second form of political risk is that the legislation can put in train political forces that weren't there without the legislation, that can then change the environment and result, as we have seen in the past, with slow or sometimes even rapid reversals by Congress, as Congress, as it were, unleashes the political forces and responses to them. Because Congress, of course, is responsive to the American public. And it's that responsiveness, of course, which is what makes Social Security not a wildly dangerous risk for people. It's called an entitlement program for a good reason. As long as the American people feel strongly entitled to it, Congress isn't going to take it away on a whim, but Congress will have to respond to a changing environment, changing demographic environment, changing economic environment.
That's why we're doing these hearings, and hopefully we'll get an answer out of it.
And political risks are there with individual accounts, and they're there with a pure defined benefit system, and they're there with a mixed system. Let's take a mixed system, because that's what's really on the table, such as the one that Congressman Colby talked about. If payroll tax revenue starts growing more slowly, and the Office of the Actuary comes in and says the residual defined benefit program is now in actuarial imbalance, Congress will need to do something about it. What Congress will do will be different from what Congress would have done if the individual accounts hadn't been set up. But it may have exactly as big a problem anyway. So the same amount of risk may be there, concentrated on one part of the income distribution, benefit distribution, rather than the whole thing.
Dr. Diamond, I'd like to get some others. Thank you. Mike?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think that there are three political risks that I think are very severe. One is, I think it is very unlikely that very large surpluses can accumulate for a very long time without being spent on other things, as is happening currently with the short-run operating surpluses and Social Security. If we're contemplating building this into trillions of dollars, I believe that will put great pressure to do something else and perhaps squander those resources. So I think that is that is a history of what's gone on when surpluses have occurred, when states have tried to run surpluses for a span of time. They found it very difficult to do so. Secondly, I believe that there is political risk that if this sort of thing is done inside the government, that there are corporate governance issues that would be potentially very troubling if the government owned a sizable fraction of equities, even if it was limited in any individual firm, and when there was a fad or an issue or a sanction or something going on, there'd be tremendous pressure to do that. Now, the TSP has some good procedures to resist that, and Mr. Kavanaugh is to be commended for his role in that. The third thing is, I think most people, ranging from my Stanford students to most people I talk to in the general public about this, trust something being their own money rather than something sitting in the government that they're going to get later. And I think there's a big difference by generation. It's partly your generational experiences. It's partly most people realize that if they're already retired, there won't be radical changes in their Social Security. You start to go down the age distribution, most people believe that if they keep on the current path, that the system will be means tested, something will happen to it, and they will get nothing. And I think they're probably right about that.
Thank you. Let's see.
One of the, can I speak to that?
I'll get in trouble with the rest of my panel if I go past my time. Mr. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Boskin, I want to ask you about this testimony we heard from Dr. Diamond concerning the asset swap, the whole idea of there being, if there was new revenue, then there would be some advantages. This was kind of the first time I've heard this kind of direction in terms of not saying that there would be a benefit here for the American investor, for the retiree. Would you address specifically Dr. Diamond's testimony, where you disagree, if you do, and where he has erred?
Well, I think as far as he had time to go, he is correct. I think he's partly correct. I think for some parts, for some people, there will be an increase in saving, and there will be an increase, therefore, in investment in the economy, and other good things will happen. I think for some people, this will be rearranged. Okay, so I think he is partly correct.
When we're talking about
I think Chairman Greenspan has tried to make us, hasn't he?
There are two issues here. One issue is whether you put in new revenue, and does all the new revenue show up as additional savings, or people knowing that they have more cut back on their own savings?
Yeah.
If all you've done is shift some of the funds and cut back on the defined benefits to match that, then people don't have additional amounts out there. It doesn't represent additional savings. And if there's any effect at all, if we get the kind of increased confidence that's been described here, then that would be a reason to cut back on savings. So unless there's new revenue, the creation of the individual account by themselves, as was said, as Alan Greenspan has pointed out, focusing on trust fund investment, but the same point holds with individual accounts. Unless there's new revenue, it's an asset swap, whether it's individual accounts or not.
Dr. Schieber? Or Dr.
I think they both have kind of summarized the issue.
For people who are liquidity constrained, low-income people who save nothing, of whom are, unfortunately, there are too many, their mandatory individual accounts would change their behavior.
Let me, again, I don't think we're disagreeing. Mandatory individual accounts on top of everything else will change their behavior. That means a new revenue source. Individual accounts, which are just a shift out of the defined benefits they would get, will not change their behavior.
Let me try to be clear. The missing item is, compare two systems. One is, say, where you allocated projected surpluses, which hopefully will materialize, to establish individual accounts. Okay? And so that's basically taking a tax cut, giving it to people and saying, you now must save it, so it's going into savings. Alternatively, suppose instead of that, you took 2 percentage points of the FICA tax and put it over there. There'd be saving there, but unless you made up, and this is the new revenue Peter's talking about, the 2 percentage points in the FICA tax, or cut the benefits somehow so there wasn't a 2 percentage point gap on the FICA side, then you'd get the saving over here and the dissaving over here, and they'd match. That's what he's trying to say. Is that clear?
So there's more agreement than disagreement here.
Absolutely. We're the co-chairs of the National Academy of Social Insurance panel on privatization of Social Security, hoping to have a report out in September. And we've yet to disagree on anything except whether there should be individual accounts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's just a small difference of opinion. Mr. Collins will inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boskin, I'm one of those individuals who feels like that money that's been deducted from my payroll check all these years is my money too. And, you know, I someday want a return on it. If I should decease before the time that I'm eligible, I feel like my estate should have that return. So I think it's time we took a real look at Social Security. You mentioned that there's an unfunded liability out there of some $10 trillion. Explain where you get that figure, please, sir.
Well, there are many figures out there, and there are many different concepts, but as a rough general approximation, if you took the projections of future benefits and discounted them back to the present based on the intermediate assumptions about wage growth and so on in the demography, and the projections of what current tax revenue would yield, and discounted that back to the present, there'd be about a $10 trillion gap or more, depending on how you dealt with, how far out you went and a variety of other things.
I understand that, but there's one figure that you haven't laid out there. How long are you projecting that?
Well, most of these projections are either the different studies either look at the 75-year period of Social Security, which ignores the fact there'd be an additional large problem thereafter, with benefits only able to be, only 3/4 of benefits financeable by current taxes, or they have a specific proposal, for example, switch to mandatory, like Cato or somebody else, switch to individual accounts now, maybe starting at a certain age and phased in over a certain time profile, and we still have to pay the benefits to the retirees or people soon to retire, and what's the difference?
Yeah.
And so the number can be smaller or larger.
But you're talking about $10 trillion over a 75-year period. I mean, it sounds a lot more severe when you say $10 trillion unfunded liability than it does when you say $10 trillion over 75
well,
years.
remember, this is...
There's quite a difference in the concept of how you look at the $10 trillion. And also that difference in that concept can have a difference in how you determine, too, what you're going to do about the generations behind my generation, which I'm a World War II generation, and how you're going to address their Social Security benefits in the future as well as their deposits today. It can have a significant difference in how you approach it.
That's fair enough, but the $10 trillion, which could be still larger, depending on how you define things, should be compared, for example, to the current explicit national debt, which is about half that size. So it's a stock that, so if we tried to finance this under these projections for the future, under many of these plans, full privatization plans, you'd have to issue $10 trillion worth of bonds.
$10 trillion is also right close to the figure we just dealt with a 5-year budget proposal, and where we carved out 1% savings. So it's, you know, it's how you look at $10 trillion.
Oh, it's certainly $10 trillion over an economy that will be vastly larger than that.
We won't debate that any further.
Yeah.
Mr. Diamond, you mentioned that the unfunded liability exists because Congress voted to give retirees of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s far more in benefits than they could have been financed by the taxes each of these groups paid. Based on that range of beneficiaries, how long would it take them to actually get in return the funds that they had put into the trust fund that had been deducted from their payroll checks?
I don't have a figure cohort by cohort. That analysis, which is done by John Giannakopoulos, Olivia Mitchell, and Steve Zeldis, and will appear in a volume from the Conference of the National Academy of Social Insurance, just to get another plug-in.
So you don't really have a figure.
Accumulates up, but there is a graph that breaks it down separately, cohort by cohort. That is, the people who were born in a particular year look at the taxes they all paid, everyone born in that
I have
year,
one more
and
question.
the benefits.
But you don't have any
A
figures.
few
You
years.
have a
I don't have
figure-
that picture
You have
with
a
me.
figure of speech rather than figures.
A
What
few
about
years.
today? What about a young person entering the workforce today who, say they pay the average or pay the maximum throughout their working lifetime? Based on those, on a maximum participation, how long would it take them to receive their benefits?
I don't have that number, sir. You can get that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Port,
I can give you the answer to that, longer than their life expectancy. They expect to get back less than they pay in. They and their employers pay in.
That's right. That's kind of the way it was set up in 1935, was it not?
I'm sorry?
Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having these hearings. This is the second one of our hearings on individual accounts, and it's interesting, in the interim since our last one, we had a meeting in my district of the Committee for Responsible Budget. This is the exercise in hard choices. Some of you may have been involved in that. Almost every group from AARP to the Concord Coalition was engaged in it. And in our little group, which was about 117 people, we broke down into groups, 16 groups. 73% of the groups favored some form of personal individual accounts. And they were given information on what some of the choices would be if you went to individual accounts. And I think the figures around the country are comparable to that. Maybe 73% is a little on the high side in my area. But it goes to what Michael Boskin was talking about earlier, which is as folks look at this and begin to think about the alternatives, and particularly the alternative of the status quo, individual accounts, I think, are becoming more and more popular. This was a day-long session where we actually went into some detail. My question, though, is related to individual accounts and the current employer-based pension system, or the retirement savings systems we have through our employers, which is really the third leg of the stool, as we say, Social Security being one and personal savings being another. The third, and one that I'm particularly concerned about because it's not growing as fast as it should, is employer-based coverage. And I wonder whether an individual account could be part of someone's 401k or profit-sharing plan or simple plan for a small business, and how we could do that. And I don't know if any of the gentlemen here have spent any time looking at this issue, but the notion would be, I guess, to either set up a new form of account, which might have some more parameters on it than a current 401k might, or simply to allow rollover between the individual account and the 401k. Why? To maximize the return, to really take advantage of compound interest rates, and to simplify it so you have one account, and to encourage more and more smaller businesses to have retirement savings plans.
There's a couple of issues there. One is if you're going to have these accounts, you're probably going to end up with a mandated savings program if you're replacing you're carving out part of Social Security. The 401k system is still a voluntary system, and there's a question of whether you want to commingle voluntary money and mandatory money, because if you start to commingle that money and somebody wants to withdraw some of their voluntary money for a variety of reasons that they're allowed to do so under current law, then you're going to create a very complex situation of going in and figuring out which is apple and which is orange.
Money being fungible.
Right. Now, it seems to me, though, that there is some possibility that you could have a system where, in cases where employers do have 401k plans, that you could give employees access to the similar kinds of accounts through exactly the same vendors. Now, the vendors would have to keep track of the two sets of money separately, and you could actually run the administration of these quite together. So I think there is some prospect of doing that.
Are there some efficiencies to be gained by running, as you say, the administration together so that...
Well, certainly there would be. I mean, you've got communications programs built around it. You've already got withholding mechanisms built in. You've got reporting mechanisms for the employees. Most employees, we work with employers all the time. When they move from one employer to another, in most cases, they want to move their 401k money from one plan into the next plan because they don't want to run a half dozen different set of investment funds themselves. I mean, it's a convenience issue. I think there's a very significant prospect something like that might evolve. I do think you would have to keep the money segregated, at least for accounting purposes.
Any other thoughts from the panelists?
I think it's an interesting idea. I think that there are a couple of things to be aware of. One is that the take-up rate for 401ks has been under 100%, and
Right.
many American companies, including ones that I am involved with, have had active education programs to boost the rates up, which have been successful, but they're still under 100%. So it
Even
may
though
be
there
we
is
could build out from there, and the prospect of having this mandatory system would may in fact have the effect of making it easier for some people at the margin to graft on a private pension where it doesn't exist now. That might offset the tendency that was mentioned earlier for the private sector to pull back if there was a mandatory government account.
I'd like to add one small point on that. A major cost in running any system, current Social Security system, 401ks, any of them, is reconciliation, making sure that the money that's withheld from a worker shows up in the right worker's account and the accumulations show up. The way to hold down reconciliation costs in the aggregate is by using uniform systems. As soon as you start setting up different systems for different groups of workers, then you'll start to raise, I think, overall costs, and you may raise them more because of the lack of uniformity than you gain from the synergism of having a single intermediary handling both of them. So I think one has to be very careful to look at the whole system.
I just one quick point, Mr. Chairman, which is that may argue for the simplification and the streamlining on the pension side and more uniformity that many of us have been pushing for, and there might be a way to complement the two and get those synergies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go around one more time because I want to be able to submit to you all questions in writing that we would like
Sure.
for you to return back to us, because we do have another panel to follow you, and I don't want to go to 6 o'clock this evening. Dr. Boskin, in assessing the solutions to Social Security solvency problems, what tools in terms of analysis are important to Congress? What budgetary and economic questions must be answered at a very minimum to ensure the correct analysis is made?
Well, I think that you need to have a comprehensive accounting of what's going on in all parts of the system. As was mentioned earlier about when Congressman Colby was here, you can't just take a look at the current system and ignore the benefits that may accrue in the individual account system and so on. You have to take account as we move through time if there is if there are additional revenues and additional national saving, there may be beneficial economic effects of that we have to figure out how we're going to account for that are not currently the norm in the way that the scoring agencies think about these things. We're also going to have to reconcile the kind of procedures that are used at the CBO and Joint Tax Committee, which primarily look at 5- and 10-year horizons, and the Social Security actuaries who are commonly looking at 75-year horizons, although CBO started to look at 20- and 30-year horizons now. I think we need to reconcile demographic projections. The Census Bureau believes there'll be a lot more 100-year-olds out there several decades from now than the Social Security Administration does. I think it's important to know why. All these things are important, and you need to be aware of the sensitivity when compounded for decades of only a small difference can make.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Could I add just something quick on that? There's a tendency to focus on the main projection. But of course, there are risks around, market risks and political risks. We're better at quantifying market risks than we are at political risks. And I think it's terribly important to use what the finance community calls risk adjustment, to convert the expected value of returns into what it's worth to people when you correct it for the risks involved.
Thank you. Mr. Kavanaugh, you stated that PSA investment in a private market would probably never exceed 2%. What leads you to that conclusion?
I was referring to the fact that the PSA investments would not exceed 2% of the capitalization of the U.S. stock market.
Oh.
And because that was one of the questions that you raised. And that's based on, as I indicated in my prepared statement of some length, which I submitted for the record, I talk about a couple of different plans, and under the one that would have the greatest impact on the stock market, it would be the one that involved investing the Social Security Trust Fund in equities up to 50% of the fund. And that would come to around 2% of the total stock market in the year 2014, based on numbers used by the Advisory Council on Social Security, on the assumption that given the fact that the capitalization of the U.S. stock market right now is about $12 trillion, if you use their assumptions, you project out to 2014, it comes up to about almost $40 trillion, and their plan for investing in Social Security Trust Fund would have $1 trillion out of 40, it's 2.5%, and the PSA thing would be less than half of that because presumably in the personal savings account, you're talking or assuming what most people propose, and that is it would be 2% of payroll going into it. So that's how you come to the less than 2%.
Is there anybody else that would, go ahead, Mr. Christensen.
Dr. Boskin, I wanted to ask you, how would you go about assessing a risk-adjusted rate of return? Mr. Kavanaugh, in his written testimony, talked about a adjusted risk rate of return. What would your comments be on that? And then I want to ask also Mr. Kavanaugh.
Well, the first thing is I think you'd have to specify all the classes of risk. All the investment options have risks in various forms, including treasuries, although we expect the government not to default. Short term, there's very little inflation risk. So there are standard procedures that are used. If the investments are broadly diversified by supposition or by regulation, you can reduce that somewhat. But technically what you're doing is you're looking at the covariance of the returns, and I don't want to get too technical here, but there are ways to do that. So I think another way of saying what Professor Diamond was saying is if you took what might happen in the future, under many scenarios, for example, investing in equities would do a lot better than investing in treasuries or in bonds. But in a smaller fraction, they might do worse, and so he wants that accounted for in some way.
I think it was Dr. Diamond who talked about this risk-adjusted also. Maybe you'd comment on it, Dr. Diamond.
No, I think that's fine. There are simulation models, and Dr. Schieber has one of them, and EBRI has one, which project out returns on stocks and returns on bonds based on the pattern of statistical variation in the past. And then you can calculate, gee, if you have this portfolio, 90% of the time you do better than all bonds, and 10% of the time you do worse, or if you have that portfolio, it's 50-50, and you get a spread, and you find out both the probability of doing better and the probability of doing worse, and you can compare any two different portfolios in that way.
I'm just trying to pick up some hints here so when I can take some of this advice and take it into the market now. So all this adjusted risk on the equity markets, I want to make sure we try it out before we take it to the next step. I want to ask Dr. Kavanaugh, Mr. Kavanaugh, if there's a downturn in the stock market, will the investors in the thrift savings plan be adversely affected so that their retirement is greatly reduced? If there is, how would you go about taking this in terms of moving on to the next step with this proposal? There's a downturn in the stock market.
If there's a downturn in the stock market, how would we go about doing what, sir?
Will the investors in the thrift savings plan fund be adversely affected so that their retirement is greatly reduced?
Yes, the way of minimizing, and of course that risk is there, and you have this great volatility in the stock market that you don't have in the bond market, and that goes to the previous matter you were discussing. And there's no way that you can eliminate that risk. But what financial analysts or advisors would say, the way to minimize it is to make sure that you're not putting an awful lot of money into the market or taking an awful lot of money out at just the wrong time. And the way to avoid that is what they call dollar cost averaging. In other words, you put in a little bit every week or every month, and then when you're taking it out, you do the same. You spread it out, and you're less likely to get caught.
Dr. Schieber, you shake your head on dollar cost averaging.
Well, people, to a certain extent, naturally insure themselves against the market. If you look at how people invest 401k money, and I think that's one place you can look to see how people behave, what we see is that younger people tend to invest far more aggressively than older people. For people in their 20s, typically they will have over 60% of their assets in equities. When you, by the time they get into their 60s, it's down to 40% or less. They are insuring themselves against the market. I think it also, though, goes to the issue of how you design your reform. And there are ways, by establishing floor benefits and so forth, that you can keep people at the bottom end of the income spectrum from taking on too much financial market risk. In the final analysis, though, you cannot, FDR said it when he was signing the bill. He said, we cannot insure all of the people in this country against all of the vicissitudes of life all of the time. We've got tremendous, I believe, political risk in the system right now. It's significantly underfunded. If you look at the kinds of bills that Senator Kerry and Senator Moynihan have put forward, they are saying that there is some probability, maybe fairly significant, that benefits are going to be reduced. That's a risk. Now, the question is how we can diversify that in a reasonable fashion and protect people who are most vulnerable.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boskin, I want to go back to you and this $10 trillion. You just blowed my skirt up with that $10 trillion.
Yeah. I know the former late Senator
Let me ask you
talked
my
about billions
question
being
first. Let me ask you my question first. Do you have a schedule of years that the liability becomes a liability and each year thereafter for that 75 years? Do you have such a schedule? I think it would be very helpful.
Yes, and the Social Security Administration has it. And what this does is it takes this year by year, and then it discounts it back to the present. I may have a graph with me. If I do, I'm going to pass it up. I did bring this with me. You'll be interested.
We keep talking about investments. Investments worry me too, as an individual. It worries me from the standpoint that I may not have the best knowledge of how to invest, and I would say that probably runs concurrent with a lot of other people in the country. However, I do have faith in accounts that are interest-bearing. And if we stay focused on the generation behind us and how we can solve this problem for them, we also look back at how we've solved other problems in other areas of financial services like the savings and loans, and we agree and confess that we have to belly up to the bar and pay that bill. Then we can cover that liability and yet ensure for our young people that they're going to actually get a return on the monies that are deducted from their payroll checks. And if we do it right, I think we can reduce the amount of money that we are deducting, leaving them more of their income to direct in different type of investments that they would like to invest in.
I agree with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Portman.
Thanks, Chairman. I have a very general question, and it may not be one where there will be a long answer here this afternoon, but perhaps those who are interested could get back to me. It goes to kind of the basic approach one might want to take, and Dr. Boskin and I had a chance to talk about this recently, but looking at the Colby proposal, it's a % of the payroll tax that be taken out and invested as an individual account or a private savings account. Most of the payroll tax will continue to go to the government under the current system. Another alternative being talked about, and I think Mr. Ball's approach to this would be allowing the trust fund itself to invest in the private market to a certain extent in the capital markets. And another alternative that I just wanted to get your input on, if I could, would be to back up for a moment and say, in a sense, could you combine the two by allowing individual accounts, perhaps along the lines of some of the models we've seen in South America, and the notion is a highly regulated individual account where I, as a payroll tax payer, would be paying into the system just as I am now, but it would go into my account. It would be highly regulated by the government in the sense I'd be very limited in terms of the decisions I could make, but I could make decisions within certain parameters. And the government would have it all. And the government would hold it all, and money being fungible, as we said earlier, the government would then be able to pay its liabilities over this transition period. But I would have the personal decision to make as to how I would invest it in this kind of mutual fund or that kind of mutual fund in safer or more risky investments. And I just wonder if you could talk a little about that. It is, in a sense, a third way that I haven't heard much discussion about today. Dr. Shiver?
it certainly is a third way. I guess there is some skepticism as to whether or not the federal government, as this fund began to accumulate and build and get very large, and it would get extremely large, whether or not the federal government could kind of hold the dam, because there's a lot of uses for money.
So
and there's
are you concerned about Congress allowing first-time home buyers or folks who are interested in education, IRAs, or is that the sort of concern, or is
it goes beyond that? It's problems like Medicare that needs financing. We undoubtedly will go through periods where it looks like some people aren't getting enough in retirement income, and maybe we can embellish those benefits. Maybe when we have a downturn in the economy, maybe we need to give people some slack on payroll taxes. There's a long history of this having been done. The original act called for the system to be significantly funded. All throughout the 30s and 40s, we stepped back on that. If you look at the experience of the 1983 amendments, I think there are people that believe that the exercise of building up the trust fund we have right now was not an act of national saving. There's a question of whether or not we can create saving in this economy in that kind of mechanism.
I guess I want to hear from others if they have comments, but my response would be in part that even with individual accounts, as 2%, as Mr. Colby is talking about, Congress can always go back and change the parameters of that. Also, the rest of it, whether you view it as 6.2 or 12.4%, remains in the government to be moved around, as you say. And finally, is that it would be different in kind, I think, from the way Social Security was initially established, because there would be an individual account where you would have the ability as an investor to be able to determine where it went, and you'd be getting a statement monthly and so on, rather than having it going into an amorphous trust fund.
As Michael indicated earlier, he put together a proposal several years ago that would have had individual accounts. My recollection was those were more notional unfunded accounts than real accounts. I mean, you could convert the current system into an account-based system without doing any funding.
But you wouldn't have any investment.
You wouldn't have any investment.
Any other comments?
I just make two quick comments about that. One is, I've always thought one of the problems with Social Security is that we are not providing people with enough and accurate enough information. There have been some improvements made in the last few years, I want to say in the last decade or so. But many people aren't aware that the benefit projections are projections and would assume current law plus massive tax increases to fund them, stuff like that. Many people aren't aware of the different types of things they're insured against with survivors and disabilities and so on, other than very generally. And the kinds of statements you get are not sufficient, in my opinion. So that's something that I think ought to be done and could be done independent of, even if there were no funding problems or any reforms being considered. With respect to the point you made, though, I view the trade-off in the following way. I do believe there'd be a very big difference in people's minds about having an account at a private financial institution, whether the money was sent by their employer, whether they put it in, whether it was done in some more cost-effective way than a bunch of individuals trotting up with small amounts at Schwab or Fidelity or Vanguard or something like that, or many banks or whatever it happened to be, than something that, even though their name was on it and was a separate part of the statement, was inside the government. I think people would have a different reaction to that.
I think
and I would favor the former, but it's going to be a lot more costly to do unless we figure out mechanisms to reduce the cost to a tolerable amount.
In contrasting these different...
Dr. Diamond, I think I've exceeded my time here. Could I ask you to either we can speak afterwards, if you could give me your written comments, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I would tell Dr. Boskin that in the year 2000, everyone who has an account with Social Security, it's over age 25, will be receiving an annual statement.
I know.
How much they've put in, what their projected benefits will be.
I think that's a major step forward. I proposed this 20 years ago in the 1982 Advisory Commission, which led to the 83 amendments.
You weren't chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee at the time, so it didn't take effect.
I commend you. I commend you for doing that. I do believe, however, that when it has your projected benefits, What will it say about the unfunded liabilities?
Probably nothing. It
Yeah,
doesn't say anything.
that's a big concern of mine.
Well,
So it's-
I understand that, but at least we're making the
That's-
first step in the right direction.
I commend you for that. It's very important. It's important.
We
it's
want to
important.
thank you all for being here. We appreciate your input, and we will ask for the second panel to take their seats. Thank you.
Executive summary labeled as a critical question.
Dr. Lawrence White, Professor of Economics from the Stern School of Business at NYU. Yes, sir. Dr. Gary Burtless, Senior Fellow from the Economic Study Program at the Brookings Institute. Rick Edelman, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer with Edelman Financial Services. Teresa Trish, Senior Editor from Money Magazine. And Paul Heward, Senior Vice President of Policy and Communications at the National Association of Manufacturers. Dr. White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased and honored to be here and to have been invited to address the subcommittee. As all of you know, the Social Security program has been a valuable and popular program. It's been a valuable source of old age and disability support. But its structure has created serious financial problems. These problems have various manifestations. You've been talking about some of them, the unfunded liabilities, the negative expected discounted real returns of many of today's workers, or the equivalent unfavorable money's worth ratios. Or yet another manifestation is that the direct financing of the program as a self-contained entity faces serious future problems. I think an important point to make is that those problems are going to arise at a much sooner date than many of the media reports would indicate. Since this is a pay-as-you-go program, the problems will manifest themselves in terms of the annual net cash flows of the program, and those will begin to be negative in the year 2013. That's the year in which the Congress will have to find alternative ways of supporting the program, because the program itself will be running negative on an annual basis. 2013, a mere 15 years away, which for Social Security is like an eye blink. This is the year in which either other taxes will have to be raised, or other spending curtailed, or other borrowing increased. This is much sooner than the year 2032, which is the year that the media focuses on. That's a meaningless year in terms of the real consequences for the program. I believe that a PSA, a personal savings account component, is a very desirable part of the overall reform of the Social Security program. Further, I am convinced that a broad choice PSA program, basically structured the way the current investment retirement accounts, the IRA program, is structured, is the direction to go. This broad choice direction would have a number of desirable features. First, it would give participants a wide range of opportunity to tailor their investments to their tolerances for risk, for their knowledge and information, their age and family status, and other personal considerations. It would be especially valuable for the participants who are less financially sophisticated, less knowledgeable, perhaps quite risk-averse. They could, as is possible in the IRA program, choose a bank account, a certificate of deposit, a credit union account, a savings institution account, an insurance company, similar vehicle for their investments. It is instructive that as of 1996, over a quarter, 26.3% of the funds in IRAs are invested in such funds. As recently as 1991, this figure was almost half, 47%. Second, a broad-based program would bring a regulated financial institution into the picture, since the regulated financial institution would be the place, the first point of contact for the investment of such funds. With the regulated financial institution would come its fiduciary and advising obligations to the participants. Third, it would bring the creative and competitive forces of the financial services sector into the picture to devise appropriate instruments and educate the program's participants. Fourth, to the extent that participants do choose the bank accounts or similar instruments offered by financial intermediaries, this route will provide a financing channel for the millions of small enterprises in the U.S. economy that are not publicly traded, that would not benefit from the investments in index funds that would be the consequence of a more centralized financing mechanism. These are the millions of small enterprises that rely on bank finance or similar types of financial intermediary advance. There are only 10,000 publicly traded companies in the U.S. economy. These are the larger enterprises. They are the ones who would benefit. A broad choice would bring the other millions of enterprises into the picture as well. A potential negative consequence are the transactions costs of broad-based plan. I am convinced that there are ways of dealing with this problem. The competitive forces of the financial services sector will help deal with it. The IRA program manages to deal with it. The federal government could be an accumulator to help build up sufficient balances. In summary, Mr. Chairman, the problems are serious. Reform is necessary. A broad-choiced PSA component should be part of that reform. The time to act is now. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you for the invitation. I'll confine my remarks to just a couple of points. First, the nation's interest in replacing part or all of traditional Social Security with a system of individual accounts is driven by a widespread recognition that rates of return on the contributions that people will get from their Social Security are going down and eventually may reach 1 or 1.5% for a typical worker. Now, Americans compare this with a situation in which in the last 15 years, the period ending in January of this year, they could have earned 13.3% after subtracting for the influence of inflation on stock market investments. Advocates of individual retirement accounts sometimes suggest that we can eliminate or reduce the traditional system in which workers' rate of return will be negative or very low, with a new system in which they can get these high rates of return if we establish individual accounts. Now, this beguiling invitation is based on a fundamental confusion. About 90% of the contributions we make for Social Security each year go directly to pay for benefits to our parents and grandparents, to our disabled relatives, and to the dependents of retirees and disabled people. We're going to have to make payments to these people for the next 40 or 50 years, regardless of anything we do about establishing individual accounts. So there's no way we're going to earn 8%, 10%, or even 2% on this part of our contributions. They're going to pay for current benefits. They cannot be used for investments in stocks, bonds, real estate, or any other thing your stockbroker might want to sell you. The only questions are, A, how can we invest the surplus of contributions over current benefit payments, and B, how can we change things so the surplus gets bigger or lasts longer? The answer to question A is that we can certainly invest the surplus in assets that earn a higher expected rate of return. All we have to do is change the assets that we permit the trustees to invest in. expand the recipe, expand the menu of alternatives to include mortgage debt, corporate bonds, and equities. The answer to question B, how can we increase the size of the surplus, is also obvious. We must either cut benefits or increase contributions, and we must do so fairly soon. The crucial issue is how much of each of these things should we do, increase contributions or cut benefits. My second point, the claim that individual accounts can yield workers a rate of return of 7 or 8% on their contributions must be assessed against the risk of investments in individual accounts. Bear in mind that the 13.5% real return we saw in the 15-year period ending January was far above the average 15-year return that U.S. equity markets have yielded over the last 130 years. In the 15-year period that ended in January 1982, for example, the annual real return on stock market investments held for 15 years was minus 0.7%. That's why in 1982 we didn't hear lots of discussion when Social Security faced a financing crisis of how attractive the stock market looked like as an alternative. No one was going to talk about stock market investments when their previous returns had been negative over such a long period. Since 1871, there have been 113 15-year periods over which we can calculate the real rate of return on a dollar invested in U.S. equities. In 6 of those periods, the returns were negative. In 8, the return was 13% a year or higher. So clearly, the recent return has been exceptional. The arithmetic average of the 15-year returns was 6.6%. Now, many people mistakenly think that these ups and downs in the stock market average out over time, assuring that even the people who invest forever will be assured a high rate of return. But that's not true. If you happen to retire in 1931 or in 1975, your pension would have purchased a lot less in the way of retirement consumption for you, and that simply follows from the fact that the assets that you'd accumulated over your life fell substantially in value in a very short period of time. The chart at the end of my table tries to perform calculations showing you what the replacement rate of a pension invested in individual accounts would have been for workers retiring after a 40-year career in 1910, 1911, and so on, up through 1997. The message of that chart is clear. These investments do not yield a highly secure retirement income. The average rate of return is good. It's just that in a 1 or 2 year period, the pension that you can accumulate if you invest in the stock market or any other portfolio for that matter can go up and down a lot. And I don't think that the mandatory public pension system should force people to rely on that kind of a system. Thank you.
Mr. Edelman, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to testify today. I'm honored to be here. My perspective comes as one who practices in the financial planning environment. I am also one of the most active financial educators in the field between 2 radio and television shows, teaching at Georgetown, and doing seminars across the country and 2 best-selling books. I spend a lot of time with ordinary consumers in addition to my financial planning practice. My perspective is a little bit different. The benefits are obvious, and I don't think we need to belabor the point terribly much, but I do want to specifically cite 5 particular groups that are going to benefit dramatically from the concept of establishing PSAs with the Social Security system. The first, obviously, is the money management industry overall, which gets to manage and invest all of that money and earn asset management fees. Financial advisors such as myself will have a field day. I mean, you'll make me rich, so thank you very much in advance. The financial education field will also do extraordinarily well in terms of teaching consumers how to handle this and all of this activities from that industry. The financial media will also do extremely well. They'll have tons to write about for years to come. And the advertising industry will also do extraordinarily well as they do all of the printing and buying all the ad time and the ad placements in magazines, radio, and TV, and so on. So the trickle-down theory at its best, I think, can be well suggested from establishing PSAs. Unfortunately, there's a major flaw in the effort. the vast majority of Americans do not know how to invest. When I first came upon the concept of privatizing the Social Security system, it seemed that the original notion was to take X percentage of the FICA contributions, put them into the stock market in order to get a higher rate of return, which may or may not exist in the first place. Well, how did we go from the notion of putting some of the Social Security Trust Fund into stocks to the notion of, well, let's let individual consumers make the decision on how that money is to be invested, which is what the PSA concept does. If we allow consumers to have control over their own decisions, two things are going to happen. Number one, they're going to make the wrong investment choices in a great majority of the time, just as they do currently with their IRAs and they do currently with their 401ks. And second, they will change their investment decisions at precisely the wrong period of time, immediately following a stock market crash, immediately on the bad news of something happened in the marketplace. Take a look at the topsy-turvy aspects going on in the markets right now. In fact, it raises one question I have in my mind, which has been suggested earlier. If we weren't experiencing an 18-year bull market that we are currently having right now since the early 1980s, would we even be talking about the idea of putting some of the money into the stock market? The question was asked earlier, what are the political risks associated with this decision? Well, there are none as long as the stock market performs very nicely. But what happens if the stock market drops 3,000 points because of something happening in Japan, with Alan Greenspan rushing to the White House to confer with the president about what to do next, and consumers who are placing their Social Security money into the stock market suddenly want to withdraw that money as quickly as they had been so happily ready to add it? The sudden decrease or the outflow of money from the stock market would have a tremendously detrimental effect on the overall stock market and, as a result, the economy as a net effect. Therefore, I would like to suggest an alternative proposal that I think might allow us to have our good news and avoid the bad news, and that is to establish a system that is similar to that used by the federal campaign contributions. We currently allow taxpayers every year when they do their tax return to choose whether or not they want to put $3 of their tax payment into a segregated fund that the federal government controls. The Federal Election Commission takes those $3 and allocates them to the candidates under a system established by the government. Consumers have no say over how the $3 is spent after they decide to put in the $3. We could do the same thing with a different system. Allow workers on their W-9 every year to determine how much of their money they want to put into stocks, up to a limit set by Congress, such as 2 percentage points of the FICA payment. Once the consumer makes that election, it's then up to the government, through a system similar to the FEC, to make the decision of how that money is going to be invested. Don't leave it up to individual consumers, as much as I personally and professionally would enjoy that decision. I don't think it's in the best interest of consumers. This would be extremely easy to administer. The systems are already in place on the W-9, and we need to do one final thing: make it a one-way trip. Once money is going into the stock market, the ability to remove it because of fears over current or future market conditions must not occur, or we will be contributing to a topsy-turvy marketplace that will cause significant problems in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to recess to go vote. I apologize, Ms. Trish, but we have to go to the floor, and we'll be back as soon as possible. So we stand in recess.
Hurry up and wait. Can't be very subtle in 5 minutes. No. No.
We're going to agree today. In fact, I was hoping you would come to before me. I was going to say that. Start.
These points about risk.
We were about to hear from Ms. Trish.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss personal savings accounts within Social Security. I've been asked to address two related issues. First, whether Americans in general are currently knowledgeable enough about financial markets to make sound investing decisions, and if not, what would be required to raise Americans' financial IQ to a level at which they could be reasonably secure about investing their tax dollars on their own. Much of the survey data and anecdotal evidence on investor preparedness points to one conclusion. That is, overall, individuals are ill-equipped to make fundamental decisions about investing. A case in point, in 1996 and again in 1998, Money Magazine and the Vanguard Funds Group tested the basic investing knowledge of roughly 1,500 people who own mutual funds directly or through a retirement plan at work. In 1996, the average test score was 49 out of 100. In 1998, investors averaged 51 out of 100. Performances that deserve an F even by today's liberal grading standards. Clearly, if individuals who have money in mutual funds fail a test on investing basics, one can only assume that the roughly 60% of Americans who have no such investments are even less informed. The negligible improvement in test scores from 1996 to 1998 is especially dismaying when you consider that during that time, investors poured more than $700 billion into mutual funds. Many proponents of Social Security privatization have equated individuals' increased participation in the markets with increased financial sophistication. But as the Money Vanguard data shows, increasing participation in the markets does not necessarily correlate to investor savvy. Rather, individuals may be fooled by the long-running bull market into believing they possess an investing prowess that has, in fact, never been tested by adverse market and economic conditions. Worse, investing experience that is confined to boom times can actually engender or reinforce faulty investing beliefs. The top 4 wrong-headed attitudes I've encountered are the notions that stocks, particularly U.S. blue chips, are the only place to be invested, that market downturns are rare, brief, and relatively painless, that fees and expenses are unimportant in determining one's investment return, and that inflation is not a threat. Unfortunately, misperceptions like these are fueling, at least in part, the current enthusiasm for individual Social Security accounts. That said, I believe the task of turning each American worker into a savvy investor would be unduly burdensome for the individuals and for the government. So, if individual accounts become part of Social Security, I believe that Americans would be best served by embedding sound investing basics in the rules of the program itself. For example, participation in individual accounts would have to be mandatory, thus circumventing the need to convince people to participate. Investing options would have to be limited to those that have easily explainable risk-reward profiles and low fees, such as a stock index fund, a government bond fund, and a money market fund. There would also need to be a prohibition against early withdrawals, since tapping one's account before retirement defeats the compounding on which the success of the account depends. The government should make no guarantee against loss, but could seek to provide a cushion by requiring employers to match employees' contributions. By structuring individual accounts this way, the government will mirror much of the investor education that private companies have already undertaken. Thank you again for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Heward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the National Association of Manufacturers, its 14,000 members and the 18 million people employed in manufacturing, we appreciate this opportunity to express our views. We do not believe that the Social Security system as presently constituted is demographically sustainable. We believe that the people who think it is are indulging in a large number of rosy scenarios. We think the truth is that people will live longer than is currently being estimated. Medical science will continue to prolong life. We think that taxes will have to be raised more than is being projected in order to keep the system viable, and that ultimately, if it is not transformed from its present format, it will eat the U.S. economy alive, and basically the entire incoming tax receipts of the federal government will have to be used to pay out entitlements, whether it's Social Security, retirement, Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. We believe that the Social Security system should be transformed into a two-part system which continues to provide, as it presently does, a tax-financed safety net of minimum benefits. But that part of what is currently being put into the so-called Social Security Trust Fund should, in fact, be diverted to a system of personal retirement accounts. We believe such retirement accounts should be owned by their beneficiaries. Title to those funds should not be in the government, nor should the government manage it. We believe that collection, remittance, and reporting of allocations to these accounts should be based as much as possible on the current payroll tax mechanisms, which are well known to employers and which can be handled with a minimum of administrative expense. And finally, we believe that a robust system of private employer-sponsored retirement plans should continue to be encouraged by whatever federal tax policy is in place. With that, I would submit the balance of my testimony for the record, and in the interest of time, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one question, and I'd like a yes or a no answer from each of the panelists. Do you favor retaining the status quo on Social Security without any options for taxpayers to invest part of their contributions?
No, Mr. Chairman.
It depends.
It's a pretty obvious, easy question. You can't answer it. We have to do it every day. Next, Mr. Edelman.
No, Mr. Chairman.
No.
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 Okay. If you're opposed to personal accounts, how should the system be changed to ensure its survival? Or should it? Dr. White?
If I'm opposed, I just indicated as
But you're
my
not
testimony.
opposed.
I am not opposed.
So all of you think, Mr. Edelman?
I am opposed to private savings accounts because I do not believe that ordinary consumers can make the right decisions.
What system would you replace it with in order, so far as survival?
What I would suggest is that the money, that X percentage of the contributions be segregated and diverted into an equities fund. Let Congress choose what that percentage ought to be. The number I hear most often is 2%. 2 percentage points, but that money should be placed into an index fund, not a cap-weighted index fund, but an equalization-weighted fund, and managed by an organization established by Congress, so that the individual decisions of where that money is to be invested should not be up to the individual consumer.
Okay. Then, since you were the only one who opposed, the same question goes to you again. What events or policies would you possibly change, would possibly change your position as far as personal investment accounts?
In order for me to change my position, I would want to see dramatic improvements in consumer education on personal finance. We need to begin teaching personal finance in schools on a mandatory basis. We need to have competency testing, just as we do on reading and writing and math skills, so that once we are convinced and assured that the ordinary general population is able to make intelligent long-term investment decisions, I would feel much more comfortable giving them PSA accounts for Social Security.
Let me ask you the question, because it's going to become a reality very shortly. There's going to be some bills dropped in the hopper that will say to us, take part of the surplus and add it on to the Social Security system as we know it now, and start a personal savings account for each individual that's in the Social Security system. Give me your thoughts on that. All right.
I think that's the wrong approach. I think, as Dr. Burtles pointed out, what we have currently is a system of intergenerational wealth transfer. I think a far better use for the surplus is to fund the transition. If you divert X percent of the current payroll tax into private savings accounts, you are not going to have enough to pay current benefits. It seems to me that what you need to do is divert the surplus to finance the transition and pay the current beneficiaries who are entitled to what the system has promised them. Because that's the real problem here in going to a system of personal or private accounts, is you're going from a system where each retiring generation is riding on the backs of the succeeding generations to a system where generations are paying or pre-funding their own retirement. Well, you've left a stranded generation there, and I think you need to use the surplus to pay off their benefits.
Anybody else want to?
I think that the idea of starting a newborn out with a retirement account, $1,000 and $500 a year as you go along until the child is 5, sounds good because you get a very graphic example of what compounding can do to a relatively small sum of money. But is that really the way that we want to be spending our money, and is that really where the priority should be? I don't think that by severing somehow the retirement savings from what someone earns during their working life is necessarily going to help people in the long run or make the system more understandable. So I would be opposed to starting out a savings account at an age that's far before someone even joins the workforce. I also wanted to clarify my position on one thing. I'm not opposed to individual accounts at this point because I think this is a very healthy debate. As I think I indicated in my testimony, I don't think that individuals by and large are ready to take on this responsibility.
Mr. Collins, inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot has been said about individual accounts. Maybe I've just been misled all my working life, but I thought I had an individual account at the Social Security Administration. I have an individual Social Security number, and I hope somebody over there has been crediting my account with the monies that's been deducted from my payroll check over the last 40 years. So under the assumption I do have an individual account. And Mr. Hurd, I kind of like what you talked about with the surplus and how to address usage of those surplus and the shortfall and what the liability we have. But I disagree with you that the problem is because people are living longer. That's not the problem with the Social Security system. The problem goes back to what was pointed out in the earlier panel, that a lot of the liability lies on the fact that retirees in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s are receiving or did receive, many of them are not in the system now because they passed on, that's the only flaw in that sentence, receiving or received more benefits than they paid in. Now that's a transfer of money. And under the Constitution of the United States, I don't believe the Congress really has the legality to transfer money from one individual to another. But that's what has happened over the years. And that's the reason we need to straighten out these individual accounts to make sure that each individual understands how much they have in there. And if you're going to have safety nets, as this was sold under as a safety net, then those safety net, those funds should come from the general fund, not from other people's investment into their Social Security account. That's what's wrong with the Social Security system. It's not that people are living longer. That's great that people are living longer. Many of them stay productive for years and years after the retirement age. But the problem goes back to how Congress has handled this in the past with the benefit program, and Congress has got to deal with the benefit program in the future. And you have to deal with it from two funds. The funds that are paid in by the individual into the Social Security accounts that is accredited to their account, and you have to deal with it with surplus general funds, or you're going to have to cut some other spending somewhere else to have the general fund because these promises have been made to these people. Those benefits have been created and established, and they're going to have to be paid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Let me, I have a bill in to take the surplus, wall it off in the Social Security Trust Fund in a special account, and not do anything with it until we have a final settlement in what we want to do on Social Security. That does a couple of things. It buys down the debt because you cannot recycle this money back out as new debt, which you can do under the current system when you take money in under the Social Security FICA taxes. You know, we just recycle it out and pay for other things. We have an IOU with the Treasury. But if you put it in a special Treasury account that can't be recycled, then that would lower the liability and lower the debt, which is good, until we come up with a solution, long-term solution to the Social Security system. Tell me what you think of that. It's not going anywhere, but I mean, I put it in, but the leadership doesn't like it.
Well, I think as a temporary transitional solution, it has a lot to recommend it. One of the concerns we have is that while we're trying to move towards a solution of the Social Security problem and a reform system, which we hope will ultimately include personal accounts, these surpluses are out there, and Congress is tempted to use them for something else. Fixing the marriage penalty, or spending more on, Medicare.
If it's laying around, we might use it.
Yeah, so I'd certainly prefer that these surpluses, as you suggest, be walled off so that they are available, because there is going to be a significant transition problem if you move to a system of personal accounts, because I will give Dr. Burtless credit, he is quite right. The current money coming into the system is going right back out again, by and large. Maybe 10% of it isn't. And if you start to divert some of that money into personal accounts, you've got to have another source of money to pay the promised benefits. And I think using the surplus for that and walling it off would be a fine idea.
Well, I look to have a solution within the next 2 years. So it wouldn't be a long term. It would be a total of about $200 billion over the next 2 years, is just about what the surplus is going to be. But the fact of the matter is, there's an awful lot of people that want to spend it and do other things with it. Go ahead, Dr. White.
Mr. Chairman, first, with respect to your statement that you hope to have a solution within 2 years, as my grandmother would have said, from your lips to God's ear, I certainly hope that is the case. However, though, in your terms, walling off the surplus, I think would be a generally fiscally responsible thing to do. It would benefit the U.S. economy. It would raise national saving. With respect to helping fix the problems of the Social Security system, it doesn't do anything because it doesn't address the pay-as-you-go nature of the system. When you go to fix the system in 2 years, the fact that you will have piled up some extra IOUs from the Treasury won't provide you with any extra real resources. The economy will be a little richer.
You can't recycle it out in new IOUs.
But you're not collecting bushels of wheat or barrels of oil.
No, but you're collecting interest on the money.
You're only getting more IOUs from the Treasury, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, okay, but
I don't
you have to read the bill.
I don't understand the proposal, because what you've just said suggests that you would not hold all of this surplus in any form that is interest-bearing.
You would hold it in government bonds, real government bonds that are interest-bearing.
But if the government is got bonds, and they also have cash in exchange for those bonds, if you're not proposing, I take it, that we did give up the interest.
No.
Okay. So the proposal then is that the government cannot do anything but retire outstanding public debt with it. I think that there is one, I agree that that would add to national saving, and in that respect it would be a good thing to do. I don't think we should just try to do it in 1 year, however. I think
I think it should be until we finally get a settlement.
But there is one confusion that a lot of people have, and that is somehow if they buy other kind of assets, like a corporate bond, the corporation is not somehow spending that money. The corporation is putting it in a safe deposit box. The corporation is doing something with any money you lend to it, too.
Generally reinvesting it, yes.
And we hope what it does is a good thing with its money, and the same thing is also what we hope the federal government does with its money. It spends it in a good way.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, I like the idea of anything that provides for long-term savings that is for retirement purposes, which is why I have concerns over new easings of IRA withdrawal provisions for first-time home ownership or for paying for college and hardship withdrawals and such. Anything we do that would divert money from the future into today's needs is something that will haunt us in the future. So your notion of walling it off and leaving it specifically for future need can only be healthy. Unfortunately, it's going to take another generation to enjoy your benefit, and does the Congress and administration have that vision?
You know, I was in the investment business for 25 years before I came to Congress. There is a great concern on the cost to benefit ratio in personal or private investment accounts. What do you think would be the interest rate that we'd have to arrive at to offset whatever costs are involved if, in fact, we pulled it completely out of government? In other words, Mr. Edelman, you'd handle all the accounts for Social Security.
Can I? Great.
Yes. What would be the cost per individual? What is your cost factors now?
Right now, it's typical to say that consumers are spending, on average, 1.5% per year in asset management fees.
1 to 1.5.
Right. So you need to make 1 to 1.5% a year to break even. Then you've got to factor in inflation. That you have to do whatever inflation's doing to break even. And then on a net tax environment, that's not typically an issue on a tax-deferred vehicle such as Social Security trust funds, but you would then have to overcome the tax liability as a third break even. In the private sector, it typically works out to 3, 4, 5%, depending on the inflationary environment.
Do any of you know what it costs right now in a thrift savings account?
It's about $25 to $30 per worker.
Per year?
Per year.
Per year.
Now, you divide that number into the amount of money the typical worker is putting into the account, and it works out to about a 4.5% cost.
4 to 4.5. So it's
as if you were to aggregate,
it's higher than a private
as a share of new contributions, not on the total value, but as a share of the money going in. Call it like a front-end load in a mutual fund, 4.5%.
Generally, thrift savings money that we in the federal government or most people put in is non-tax going in, but only tax coming out. So there would be no cost going in. It would be only on the back end of it that you would pay taxes.
And you have inflation to deal with.
I want to thank you all for being here. We're a little short. We want to submit new questions and other questions to you for your written response. Thank you. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Subcommittee stands adjourned.